Well, hey everybody, this is Dr. Austin Perlmutter. Over the last year or so, I've been investigating a question. How does COVID-19 affect the brain? I've published research on this topic, I've written about it for a variety of websites, and I've done a lot of lectures on this subject. Now I'm focusing specifically on one aspect of this question, which is, does the virus, the SARS-CoV-2 virus, actually infect the brain, or does it primarily influence our brain function in other more indirect ways after it infects the body? If you're wanting to know what the research says about this fascinating topic, you're going to want to listen to this episode of Get the Stuck Out. And before we jump in, a quick reminder that the following is not intended as a substitute for medical advice from your provider, and you should always consult with your provider before starting any new health plan changes. Okay, we got that out of the way. Let's get the stuck out. So this is episode 13 of Get the Stuck Out, and we're looking specifically at the question of, does COVID-19 infect the brain? And the reason for this podcast is because we're basically seeing an epidemic, of course, of COVID-related symptoms, that it's not just a question of the infection with the virus, but all of the other secondary effects of the virus that seem to correlate with symptoms that range from depression to brain fog to anxiety to a variety of other physical symptoms. At the time that I'm doing this podcast, over 200 million people throughout the world are thought to have been infected by this virus, the SARS-CoV-2 virus. This is thought to have contributed to over 4 million deaths around the world. And like other coronaviruses, the SARS-CoV-2 virus was thought to initially affect the lungs. This helps to explain the fact that we see so many people primarily suffering from respiratory complaints, especially as it relates to reasons for hospitalizations or for presenting to clinics and EDs. So this SARS-CoV-2 coronavirus seems to preferentially infect the lungs and cause these respiratory issues. But when you look at the widespread reports of what people are experiencing as a result of or along with their infection, it tends to be that there are many symptoms that don't really relate to the respiratory system. So GI effects have been reported as quite common, and then there are a lot of brain-related effects. So foggy thinking, worse mental health, headaches, even strokes. And so this has led researchers to pose the question, as well as the general public, I would say, as to, is COVID-19, is the SARS-CoV-2 virus actually getting into the brain? And if it is, how is it influencing our brain cells? How is it influencing our brain function? And how is that then causing us to or contributing to these symptoms that we're having? It would be perhaps easy to say that the virus is getting into the brain and it's the infection with this virus in the brain that is causing our symptoms. But when you look at the data across a range of studies, it's a bit more nuanced. So this podcast will be an attempt to explain what has been shown in the research, what perhaps hasn't been demonstrated yet, and hopefully to give a sense as to where that puts us in understanding the current picture. So let's start with a little bit of background. Prior to COVID-19, there was already pretty decent context with the connection between immunological diseases and brain function. So looking specifically at microbial infections, things like HIV and Zika virus, those have been described as having effects on our cognition, on our brain function. Maybe a little bit more interesting, looking at conditions like rabies and toxoplasmosis. Each of those has also been correlated with, in humans, specific patterns of changes in behavior as well as psychiatric state. And then we have immune states like autoimmunity. Kind of the prototypical state would be lupus, which has been also linked to a wide variety of cognitive changes. If we look more specifically at the two recent coronavirus outbreaks, so those would be SARS and then Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, or MERS, that occurred prior to this current coronavirus pandemic, each of those had correlations with higher rates of psychiatric symptoms. Those included depression, anxiety, as well as cognitive symptoms, so impaired memory, confusion, trouble concentrating. And in each of these cases, they were able to do imaging and pathology reports that did show some changes in both the brain imaging state as well as what was seen on these pathology slides. With that said, Compared to what we're seeing now with SARS-CoV-2, those outbreaks were incredibly limited. So far, far fewer people were thought to have been exposed to the first SARS pandemic or the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome or MERS pandemic than have been in the SARS-CoV-2 or the COVID-19 pandemic. So the important point here is, even if there's a very small number of people who are experiencing brain issues as a result of the coronavirus or I should say COVID-19 infection, that could still represent a huge chunk of the global population. We're talking potentially millions of people here, even if it's a 1% chance of having brain symptoms. So it's really important, I think, to look at this issue because we know that brain state and brain function is one of the most important things as it relates to quality of life and the ability to kind of interact with the world in a meaningful way. So again, the question that I'm trying to ask in this podcast is, are these rates of brain-related symptoms in people who have had COVID related specifically to this virus having made its way into the central nervous system, or is it more a reflection of perhaps activation of other immune pathways in other areas of the body that may then translate into brain changes? One of the questions that needs to be addressed as it relates to answering this larger question of whether SARS-CoV-2 infects the brain is, can it actually get to the brain? And I think this is a really important question because when you think about the brain, it has this amazing ability to kind of screen out various molecules and microbes in the bloodstream. This is the blood-brain barrier, which is this kind of bilayer that separates what is happening outside of the body, I should say, in the rest of the body in the bloodstream, with what is happening inside the brain. Actually, let's go back. Shouldn't really be characterized as a bilayer. What we have here is basically a combination of multiple cell types, astrocytes, parasites, endothelial cells, that creates this, again, barrier between the bloodstream and what is happening inside the brain. And it specifically keeps out a lot of the bigger proteins and other molecules in the body, and it also keeps out a lot of the microbes that might otherwise make their way into the brain. So let's talk about, again, how a bug like the coronavirus could make its way from the rest of the body into the brain. There are two main pathways that have been described that may connect virus outside the body to virus inside the brain. The more important, likely, of these two pathways involves hematogenous or blood-based spread. So when you look at testing for the coronavirus, usually we would test for the virus in the nasal cavity, right? So you do a nasal swab. And the reason for that is because the virus is thought to concentrate on surfaces within the respiratory system. But it's also thought that the virus may often get through this respiratory epithelium and make its way into the bloodstream. So this may then increase the chances that the virus gets into the blood and therefore spreads to other parts of the body, including potentially the brain and other organs. And so it has been found that when you test the blood of people with COVID-19, that higher levels of the SARS-CoV-2 RNA in their blood correlates with worse outcomes from COVID-19. So this may actually represent kind of a central mechanism that promotes dissemination of the virus throughout the body and therefore worse outcomes, including the possibility for brain invasion. Again, the brain is relatively protected against pathogens because of this blood-brain barrier. So there is still this question of, even if this virus got into the blood, could it actually make its way from the blood into the brain? How is this possible? So one potential avenue is that the virus might bind to what is called the angiotensin-converting enzyme 2 receptor, which is a mouthful, but the ACE2 receptor is a quicker way of saying that. And then after binding to this receptor, the virus could transfer across the blood-brain barrier and make its way into our brain tissue. There was research published in the Journal of Medical Virology recently that suggested this is the most likely path for which the virus could get into the brain. There's another hypothesis here that involves the virus getting into immune cells, which then make their way through the blood-brain barrier or through other areas like the choroid plexus or the meninges, which are areas that the barrier is actually a little bit thinner and more permeable. And basically that this immune cell, which is infected with the virus, becomes what is, in essence, a Trojan horse. It's actually been called the Trojan horse mechanism. It's still unclear whether this is contributing in any meaningful way to infection of the brain in COVID. Let's now transition to what is arguably a more interesting way that this virus could get into the brain, and that is what is called retrograde neuronal transport, which I'll break down for you here a little bit. The idea is that we have these nerves that run out of our brains. They're called our cranial nerves. And one of these nerves is actually the olfactory nerve, which carries sensory data from the inside of our nose to our brains. So it's how we can smell things. But it also means that we have these nerve fibers that are relatively exposed, and they're kind of dangling in there. Shouldn't say dangling. They're basically embedded in what is called the cribriform plate, which is found up above our nose. And these receptors that live at the tips of these nerve terminals could potentially uptake this coronavirus, or the coronavirus could basically get into these nerves and then work its way retrograde up until it reaches the brain itself, the central nervous system. It's been proposed primarily as a mechanism that may connect the olfactory nerve, which is cranial nerve 1, with what happens inside the brain. But it's also thought that this could happen through the vagus nerve or the trigeminal nerve, so that any of these cranial nerves could, in essence, become viral ladders, where the virus is creeping its way up into the brain by latching on to some of these nerves. And there's some evidence for the role of the olfactory nerve primarily, which comes from a paper published in Nature Neuroscience. This paper has been cited, I think, several hundred times, and the researchers in this found evidence of the SARS-CoV-2 virus in the olfactory nerve tissue. So basically, the nerves of of cranial nerve 1. As it relates to how they could actually get into this nerve, there's not too much data suggesting that this nerve actually has ACE2 receptors or high concentrations of ACE2 receptors. So it may actually be that because the nasal mucosa, or the cells around these nerve terminals, are so enriched in ACE2 that the virus can just concentrate, and through some mechanism we're not sure of yet, it can penetrate it, make its way into the nerve, and then crawl its way up to the brain. Okay, so there were, again, two mechanisms by which the virus could infect the brain. One being going through the blood, either by binding directly to the blood-brain barrier or by hijacking or Trojan horsing its way through on an immune cell, and then the other one being this retrograde nerve transfer by which the virus can kind of latch on to these nerves and then crawl its way up into the brain. So the next question would be, do we actually have good data suggesting that this virus gets into and infects the brain? There are a couple of different areas that we can look at here. One is looking at the brain tissue of people who have died who had COVID. So really important here before we jump into this section that you can't just take brain tissue from people like you would a lab. It's definitely not something that you do regularly in the hospital unless there's a really, really good reason for it, like you're unsure if there's an infection or a cancer and you need a biopsy, or unless a person is already dead, in which case you can take a tissue sample without obviously causing too much harm to the person. So that means that brain pathology or brain tissue analysis as it relates to COVID, like many other cases, is just going to be far more limited. You're not getting data from people who had COVID and recovered well. As it relates to the brain pathology around COVID-19, there's been a pretty decent mixture in what the findings have been. So some of these findings that have been a little bit more consistent include evidence of either bleeding or clot, so hematologic findings. There have been other studies that have shown damage due to low oxygen concentration, which is called hypoxia. There's other research showing that inflammation and activation of brain immune cells seems to be present. And while it does seem like damage to neurons, which are the primary brain cells, has been proposed as one of the central mechanisms, there's also one interesting study that shows that a brain helper cell called an astrocyte may be particularly susceptible to the virus. I want to be clear, though, that just because there's pathology in the brain, that doesn't mean that the virus itself has made its way into the brain. So it is really important to note that there are a couple of studies that have confirmed evidence of RNA from the coronavirus in brain tissue. This seems very scary, but I think it's important to note that the levels of this viral RNA are really low compared to what is found in other tissues. and it hasn't been a ton of studies that have shown evidence for this RNA in the brain itself. Okay, let's move on now to cerebrospinal fluid, which is also called CSF, abbreviated as CSF. Why this is important is because, as I said, you don't really want to, or you can't really sample brain tissue from as many people as you might want to in order to get more concrete results. So it tends to be in the realm of neurology that you go with slightly less invasive sampling, of which a good example would be cerebrospinal fluid, which is basically a clear fluid that protects the brain and buffers the brain against impact, and that runs all the way around the brain and into the spinal column. So let's talk about what is seen in the CSF in people with COVID. One of the most common results is an elevation in protein in the cerebrospinal fluid, and that was actually shown in one analysis to be present in up to 100% of patients with fatal COVID-19. However, elevation in protein in the CSF is relatively nonspecific. You can see this in stroke, you can see this in infection, you can see this in brain tumors. Another paper has more specifically reviewed evidence for SARS-CoV-2 in the CSF using PCR testing. So again, looking for the RNA signature of the virus. And what this paper found was, despite the fact that 76% of people who had these CSF samples done were presenting primarily for a neurologic complaint, only 6% had positive test results in the CSF for the virus. And the researchers stated that this provides evidence for the fact that there really isn't a ton of data for viral penetration into the brain, even when people are having brain-related symptoms. So kind of a key thing there is that there's not necessarily a strong correlation between people having neurological symptoms when they get COVID-19 and evidence for this virus in their brains by way of the CSF. Okay, so we've kind of covered how the virus could get into the brain and then data for the virus actually being in the brain. And so the last piece of this is to discuss that if there isn't a ton of data for the virus making its way into the brain, what else could help explain all of these brain-centric symptoms that people are experiencing when they get COVID-19? So a couple of ideas here. One is when you look at what happens in the brain in the results or in the context of a severe infection like COVID-19, inflammatory signals and what are called glial cells are supporting cells in the brain that are non-neurons, both seem to play a key role. So let's talk first about inflammation. One thing we do know in the context of COVID is that a hyper-inflammatory response doesn't appear to be too uncommon. And it's actually been given a name, the cytokine storm. It's an intense inflammatory state during which there are elevations in the bloodstream of immune proteins and cells. And it is notable that when levels of inflammation go up very high, there is an association with a breakdown in the blood-brain barrier. And this is primarily looking at animal research, but there's evidence that in the context, again, of high levels of inflammation, the blood-brain barrier could become a bit more leaky, and that would allow for the penetration of immune cells and these inflammatory proteins from the bloodstream to basically get into the brain, where they could increase inflammation within the brain. Inflammation within the brain does correlate with things like depression, so there maybe is a connection here between high levels of inflammation in the bloodstream, inflammation in the brain, and then the development of many of these brain-related symptoms. Let's go now to glia, which again are these non-neuron cells in the brain that actually may be about as many in the brain or as prevalent in the brain as neurons themselves. So glial cells are the main drivers of the brain's immune state and subsequently their inflammatory state. Changes in glial cells have been implicated in cognitive disorders, implicated in mood disorders, and research has shown that one specific type of glial cell, which is called a microglial cell, could be involved in the changes seen in COVID-19. Activation of these glial cells in the brain in COVID-19 could occur by way of bloodstream signals, but it also may occur due to data that is basically imported into the brain by way of nerves like the vagus nerve. So there's a gut-brain connection that may actually influence our brain's immune system and contribute to symptoms that include mood disorders as well as cognitive issues. Okay, next up on the list, autoimmunity, specifically autoimmunity in the brain. When people have talked about how the body responds to COVID-19, one of the interesting theories has been that the immune system could actually react to itself, that because of the hyperinflammatory or immune response during COVID, the immune system could rev up to such an extent that it actually starts attacking itself. And there are a number of potential pathways that this might take. There's a term called molecular mimicry, which if you're interested, I suggest you look up. But the idea here is that there's research showing similarity between SARS-CoV-2 proteins and brain proteins. So as the body revs up its response and starts attacking these proteins related to the virus, it might confuse some of the brain proteins with virus proteins and, in essence, start damaging the brain itself. Overall, I won't say that there's a ton of research that I've seen that supports that this is a primary mechanism in COVID-2. There are some correlations between autoimmune disease and COVID-19 in people having increased symptoms of autoimmune disease after they get diagnosed with or during the process of developing COVID-19. But bigger picture, I think we still have to see how much the autoimmunity mechanism helps to explain any sort of brain-related COVID symptoms. And then let's talk about brain blood flow and oxygen to the brain and how those changes during COVID may help to explain some of the brain-related symptoms. So important to, first of all, appreciate that relative to other parts of the body, the brain uses a ton of oxygen, so it's very sensitive to that oxygen supply. If you get low oxygen in your blood, or if there's a clot in your blood, the brain can take a major hit very quickly. So let's consider those two variables. There's research that I alluded to earlier that suggests that both decreased oxygen in the blood and increased clots may both be playing a role in COVID-19. There was one interesting neuroimaging study that looked at blood flow within the brain in people with COVID. And what it showed is that in these people, there was a decrease in blood flow to the frontotemporal regions of the brain. So basically, if you're watching this on the video, I'm pointing to my forehead and to my temples. That's important because these are regions of the brain that are involved with what are called executive functions. And executive functions are the ability to weigh pros and cons, to think clearly, to make more challenging decisions. So a decrease in blood flow here could actually be quite significant as it relates to our cognitive state. There's also, as I mentioned, talking about the brain pathology, some data that's showing that higher rates of basically clots as well as hemorrhage have been seen in the brain during COVID-19, as well as in other parts of the body. But again, thinking about the oxygenation and nutrient supply to brain tissue, if there are clots or any other reasons why the blood isn't reaching the brain tissue, that could be a significant problem. Okay, let's now just discuss the last but potentially very significant contributor to why people with COVID-19 have a higher risk for developing brain-related symptoms like mood and cognitive issues. And that is to consider the psychological and environmental factors that are at play. I actually wrote about this at length as it relates to the kind of overlap between psychology and the neuroscience of depression in my most recent paper in Frontiers in Neurology. But I think important to look at kind of a couple of key themes as it relates to how people with infection with COVID-19 may experience these factors. So first of all, if a person is very sick with COVID-19 and they wind up in the intensive care unit, it's important to understand there are a lot of variables at play, but that there are also many changes in their environment and in their psychological state. So in one study, up to 80% of people who were admitted in the ICU, who were critically ill, were experiencing what is called delirium. And delirium is an acute and fluctuating state of altered cognition. Why this is important is because delirium itself appears to be driven by a lot of the same kind of pathways that we've described as involved with COVID-19. So delirium may involve changes with oxygenation, may involve increases in inflammation, may involve blood flow issues. And it also may be contributed to by medications, by changes in your electrolyte status, and by changes in neurotransmitters. And really, all of these are systems that appear to be involved in cases of severe COVID. It's also, I think, an important consideration that there is stress associated with being sick, independent of what is happening within kind of some of these inflammatory infectious systems, that if you wind up in the hospital because you can't breathe very well because of COVID, you're going to be experiencing an acute stress response. And stress itself changes cognition. Stress itself is correlated with higher rates of anxiety and depression. So I think, again, if you're winding up sick enough that you need to go to the hospital, there is a psychological response that likely contributes to some of these cognitive and psychological states. I think even if you don't get into the hospital, there is a huge amount of stress that is associated with just the diagnosis of COVID-19. So this stress that you may infect somebody that you care about, or a question of how you're going to do with this or what you should do next, this could also influence a person's brain state. It's known that psychological state or psychological stress as a result of COVID-19 is basically telling us that there is an effect on our brain health, because psychological state is kind of a reflection of the state of our brains. And then I should just say that psychological stress is also known to influence immune function, and over time it is linked with physical and functional alterations in the brain. So all of these systems that we've discussed, from inflammation to glial cell activation to psychological stress, they're not independent. They all interact with each other. So if you're experiencing one of these things, it's highly likely that there are other systems at play too. Why this is important is, again, thinking about all the potential pathways that may or may not be involved with what happens in the brain in the context of COVID, I think just is key to think about all of these different systems as opposed to trying to pin it all on one specific pathway. Okay, so let's put all of this together. We're now in the second year of the COVID pandemic, and even though there has been an incredible amount of work done by people around the world, there is a lot that we don't understand about what this virus does to our brains and to our bodies. We know that a large proportion of people who get infected tend to experience brain-related psychological and cognitive symptoms, and we're just starting to understand what may be at play, what may be influencing those results. Even though there's some evidence that the SARS-CoV-2 virus does make its way into the central nervous system, and while it has been found in both brain tissue as well as the cerebrospinal fluid, researchers have been pretty clear in saying that the fact that it exists within the brain doesn't necessarily mean that it is contributing to all of these symptoms that we see. And one of the main reasons for that is the virus hasn't been consistently isolated from the brain, even in people who are having significant neurological symptoms, as well as the fact that when it is isolated, it tends not to be in as many or as high levels as might be expected, and certainly not as high of levels as what is seen in other tissues, including respiratory tissues in the body. So it may instead be the case that the brain-related symptoms that people are experiencing in conjunction with COVID-19 have more to do with changes in the brain's immune system, blood flow, oxygenation, psychological stress, and some combination of those factors may better explain it than any one on its own. Okay, well, that is episode 13 of Get the Stuck Out, where it was, I guess, more of a deep dive into a specific subset of the conversation around COVID and the brain. I hope this may have answered a few questions for you, perhaps a few questions you didn't know you had. Maybe it's created some new questions for you. I'll be posting the content and the studies from this podcast on my website soon, and if you've enjoyed this content, please leave a review wherever you're listening and follow this show on your platform of choice. You can find my other content on austinperlmutter.com, where I'm always posting new blogs and other material. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you've enjoyed this show, share it with a friend, and I will see you next time on Get the Stuck Out.